Long before the name Dracula carved itself into the imagination of the modern world, before the elegant aristocratic vampire stalked the pages of Gothic literature, there existed a far older and far darker history. A history whispered through ancient villages, carried in the breath of frightened elders, and preserved in dusty chronicles that scholars rarely dare to open. These stories belong to a time when the line between the living and the dead was fragile, when illness and nightfall brought terror, and when the idea of a creature who consumed life itself felt less like myth and more like survival. Tonight, on Ancienta, we journey back into the forgotten shadows of time, tracing the earliest roots of the vampire, those who came long before the infamous Count of Transylvania. Not the romantic figures invented by fiction, but the historical vampires believed to be real by the people who claimed to witness them. The ancient world was filled with mysteries that modern science can explain, yet one mystery continues to leave an undeniable fear etched in human memory: the belief that the dead could rise, hungry and hateful. In many civilizations, this fear predates Christianity, predates written history, and predates the very idea of monsters as entertainment. Across continents, cultures separated by oceans somehow developed the same terror: the belief that some individuals did not truly die, but returned to wander the night and prey on the living. These early vampires had no fangs, no capes, and no aristocratic elegance. They were corpses swollen from decomposition, faces twisted in death, often found with blood smeared around their mouths, with nails that seemed to grow after burial, and bodies that refused to decay. To ancient villagers, these were not natural signs of death. They were proof of something unholy. When historians search for the roots of vampire belief, they discover the same pattern repeated across civilizations: fear of the restless dead, fear of the corpse that will not stay in its grave, fear of spirits that drain life, not through a bite but through sickness, nightmares, and unexplained death. The earliest Mesopotamian civilizations left us some of the oldest references to vampiric entities. In the dusty tablets of Sumer and Akkad, scholars find stories of the Lilu and Lilitu, male and female spirits who fed on human vitality, slipping into homes at night, causing illness, faintness, or even death. The people of ancient Mesopotamia believed these beings were created from unnatural deaths, individuals whose souls were torn violently from the world and therefore became trapped between life and death. Although these spirits were not described as corpses rising from graves, the concept of a creature that drains life essence is unmistakably vampiric. For these early civilizations, the vampire was not a monster of physical hunger but a presence that drained the spirit, the breath, the life force. As civilizations grew, so did the fear. In the lands of ancient Greece, the belief in vampiric beings took on new forms. The Greeks told stories of the Lamia, a once beautiful woman transformed into a child-eating demon. She was said to sneak into homes under the cover of night, feeding on the innocent and drinking their blood. The Greeks also believed in the Vrikolakas, a corpse that returned from the grave to wander the earth, a being created from a life lived with sin, improper burial, or violence. These stories traveled across the Mediterranean, whispering themselves into the folklore of later generations. Even Greek physicians wrote accounts of corpses that appeared undecomposed or fresh with blood, which terrified villagers who thought they had encountered a Vrikolakas. They would mutilate the corpse, burn it, or stake it through the heart to ensure it would not rise again. But it was in Eastern Europe, centuries later, where the belief in historical vampires reached its most terrifying and well-documented form. The people of Slavic villages lived in a world dominated by superstition, harsh winters, and unexplained disease. When livestock suddenly died, when children fell mysteriously ill, or when a family became plagued by nightmares and weakness, they blamed not spirits but the undead. In their belief, a person who lived wickedly, died violently, or was buried improperly could return as a vampire, a literal corpse that climbed from its grave, seeking the blood or life force of the living. These vampires were not elegant. They were grotesque, swollen, pale, and stiff, often described as bloated with fresh blood. Their skin was said to stretch tight over their bodies, giving the appearance that their hair and nails had grown after death. The villagers did not know that these were natural signs of decomposition. To them, the evidence was clear: the dead were still alive. These beliefs were so widespread that early Christian churches struggled to suppress them. Priests conducted exorcisms on graves. Villagers demanded that bodies be dug up to inspect signs of vampirism. And when a corpse showed the slightest marks of blood or preservation, They reacted with violent certainty. The heart was cut out. The head was removed. The body was burned. Ashes scattered. These rituals were not myths. They were recorded events, witnessed by government officials, priests, and scholars. The people were convinced that the vampire was not a legend but a genuine threat to the community. As the centuries passed, these stories became so widespread that they sparked real investigations and real panic. In the early 18th century, long before Bram Stoker was even born, Europe experienced what historians now call the vampire epidemics. Villages in Serbia, Romania, Hungary, and Poland were paralyzed by terror. Official military reports describe corpses exhumed by locals who insisted that the bodies were fresh, filled with blood, and therefore must have been feeding on the living. Some of these corpses were said to groan when staked, a sound believed to prove their undead state. Modern science explains these groans as gases escaping from decomposing bodies, but to the terrified villagers, the dead had spoken. The most famous of these early cases would become foundational to the modern understanding of vampires. The story of Petar Blagojevich, a Serbian villager from Kisiljevo who died in 1725, is one of the earliest fully documented vampire incidents. According to Austrian military reports, villagers claimed Blagojevich returned from the dead and strangled several people as they slept. Locals insisted they had seen him wandering the village. When authorities dug up his body, they reported it looked unnaturally preserved with fresh blood around his mouth. Terrified, the villagers staked the corpse, which reportedly emitted a loud cry. This gruesome event was officially recorded and circulated across Europe, becoming one of the earliest pieces of evidence cited for the existence of vampires. Another infamous case emerged just a few years later, the case of Arnaud Paule, also from Serbia. Paule, a hajduk or soldier, was rumored to have been attacked by a vampire during his life. After his death, villagers believed he became one himself. They claimed he suffocated people in their sleep, causing them to weaken and die. When the military exhumed Paule's body, they described it as fresh, flexible, and filled with liquid blood. They reported blood flowing freely from his nose and ears, something that horrified locals. The army physician Johann Fluckinger documented the case in great detail, helping spread vampire panic throughout Europe. Soon, entire villages requested military intervention, demanding that corpses be exhumed, examined, and destroyed. These stories were not isolated. Across Poland, Hungary, Russia, and the Balkans, graveyards became battlegrounds between the living and the dead. Every unexplained death sparked suspicion. Every sudden illness was attributed to a restless corpse. In many villages, fear was so great that families would bury their dead with precautions. Stakes, rocks in the mouth, iron spikes through the legs, or heavy stones placed on the chest to prevent movement. Archaeologists still uncover these anti-vampire burials today, proof that these beliefs were not metaphorical but deeply rooted in daily life. These early European vampires were nothing like the modern idea of Dracula. They were not aristocrats nor seductive immortals. They were family members, neighbors, and villagers who, for reasons unknown to their communities, refused to stay peacefully in their graves. Their existence was a tragedy, not a fantasy, a fear born from the painful realities of disease, death, and the unknown. The fascination with blood drinkers did not stop with these well-recorded accounts. Rather, as Europe struggled through waves of plague, famine, and unexplained sickness, communities increasingly turned to the idea that invisible predators walked among them. In many villages, the fear of vampires was not only a superstition but a practical framework through which people interpreted death. The boundary between the living and the dead felt porous, and any deviation from what was considered a natural decay of the body could ignite a frenzy of suspicion. Grave diggers, midwives, and night watchmen often became unexpected witnesses to legends in the making. In some rural communities, they swore that corpses whispered or shifted position when the moon was new, and whispers like these traveled quickly, giving shape to a belief that the dead were unwilling to sleep. It was this world, fearful, uncertain, and often at the mercy of disease, that shaped the most enduring vampire archetypes of the pre-Dracula era. One of the most influential yet lesser-known figures was the Nachzehrer of German folklore. Unlike the ghoul-like revenants of Slavic tales, the Nachzehrer was not always seen wandering outside its grave. It consumed the living by gnawing at its own burial shroud or chewing its fingers inside the coffin. Each bite was believed to drain the life of its surviving kin. Villagers sometimes opened graves to find corpses with torn fabric caught between their teeth, or with fingers worn down to bone. Such discoveries were taken as irrefutable proof of vampiric behavior, and the body would be destroyed to protect the community. Even though modern science now explains these conditions as normal decomposition processes, the people of the time saw them as chilling evidence that death did not end hunger. Further south in Italy and Greece, another version of the undead haunted coastal towns and mountain villages. The vrikalakas, a corpse believed to return due to improper burial rites or moral corruption in life, became one of the most feared beings in the Mediterranean world. Sailors told stories of vrikalakas appearing on rooftops at night, calling out names. Anyone who answered was said to die soon after. On the islands, priests were sometimes hesitant to perform funerals for those rumored to be sinful, fearing that their bodies would not rest. When suspected cases arose, the community acted swiftly, often exhuming the corpse to look for signs such as a swollen abdomen, flexible limbs, or blood around the mouth, all natural results of decomposition, but interpreted then as living proof that the departed continued to feast. Ritual burnings, heart extractions, and even dismemberments were not unusual in these efforts to stop the creature from rising again. As trade routes expanded and different cultures collided, the stories of vampires evolved, absorbing new fears and adopting new characteristics. In Western Europe, where Christianity shaped the worldview, older pagan beliefs mixed with church doctrine to create a new layer of dread. Vampires became not only physical threats but spiritual ones. Servants of evil, tempters of the weak, mockeries of God's design. Monastic writings from the early medieval period include surprising mentions of restless corpses, believed to walk through cloisters or attack pilgrims on lonely roads. Priests sometimes treated these reports as manifestations of demonic influence rather than literal reanimated bodies, but the villagers did not always make such distinctions. To them, a creature that drained life was a creature to be feared, regardless of which realm it came from. This combination of religious fear and traditional folklore helped shape the vampire into a symbol of the forbidden. By the time Europe reached the Renaissance, artists and chroniclers began referencing vampiric beings in ways that blurred the line between physical horror and moral warning. The vampire became in many stories a cautionary figure, a metaphor for greed, lust, or sin consuming the soul. Yet even as these symbolic interpretations spread, the tangible fear of real vampires never disappeared. Reports continued to appear in legal documents, personal diaries, and even medical records. One physician in the 1700s, Johannes Fluckinger, famously investigated supposed vampire outbreaks in Serbia and recorded detailed autopsies of exhumed bodies. His work, intended as scientific documentation, instead fueled panic across the continent, becoming one of the most widely circulated vampire reports of the era. Meanwhile, outside Europe, other cultures maintained their own ancient blood-feeding spirits that predated all of these stories. In the Middle East, the ghoul had long been described as a creature that lurked in graveyards, consuming corpses and luring travelers to their doom. These ghouls were not always linked directly to the vampiric undead, but European writers later adopted and adapted them, further weaving global legends into one shared myth. In Asia, tales of spirits that drained life force, such as the Malaysian Langsuer or the Chinese Jiangshi, added entirely new dimensions to the idea of what a vampire could be. Although many of these stories developed independently, cultural exchange allowed their characteristics to merge over time, creating a broader and more diverse tapestry of vampiric mythology. These global influences, slowly mixing through trade, war, and storytelling, created the foundation upon which later literary vampires would stand. But before fiction could transform them into aristocratic monsters with flowing capes and hypnotic eyes, these earlier beings were grounded in the anxieties of real communities facing real threats. Their existence reflected the fears of disease, unexplained death, social chaos, and the fragile division between life and decay. The vampire in these early eras was not a romantic figure. It was a warning, a mystery, a shadow cast by the harsh realities of the world. And as the centuries progressed, these stories continued to evolve, proving that the vampire was never tied to one form or one culture. It was, and remains, a reflection of humanity itself, shaped by our fears, our beliefs, and our unending fascination with the boundary between the living and the dead. As the Enlightenment era dawned, the rational minds of Europe attempted to dismantle the old fears that had shaped vampire lore for generations, Yet the more scholars tried to explain away the supernatural, the more the public became enchanted by it. Reports of vampiric outbreaks persisted well into the 18th century, particularly in rural Eastern Europe, where the landscape itself seemed to nourish legends as readily as crops. Dense forests, long winters and isolated villages allowed stories to travel unchallenged, growing each time they were retold. Travelers brought frightening tales back to the cities, stories of corpses that refused to freeze in the cold, of bodies exhumed with pink cheeks and supple limbs, of strange marks found on the throats of the recently deceased. These accounts fascinated the urban elite, who had grown distant from the realities of rural life but still felt the allure of the unknown. In this period, the vampire transitioned from a figure of communal terror to a subject of intellectual curiosity. Physicians debated whether diseases like tuberculosis or porphyria could explain vampiric symptoms, while theologians argued that such beings were either demons impersonating the dead or manifestations of divine punishment. Yet amidst these attempts to rationalize, the old beliefs stubbornly endured. When villagers heard that doctors or priests dismissed their fears, it often made them more determined to rely on the methods handed down by their ancestors. Folk remedies, staking, burning, removing the heart, or scattering seeds to slow the vampire's return, continued to be practiced quietly in remote areas. For the people who performed them, these acts were not barbaric but necessary, the only defense against forces they believed threatened their families and livelihoods. By the time the 19th century arrived, the vampire had settled into a new role within society's imagination. No longer merely a creature of rural superstition, it became an icon of Gothic literature and dark romanticism. Writers like Polidori, whose tale of the aristocratic Lord Ruthven predated Dracula by decades, transformed the vampire into an elegant predator, a figure as seductive as it was deadly. Yet even as these literary creations captured the world's attention, the old vampire still lived on in the shadows of history. The stories of the Strigoi, the Nachzehrer, the Verkalakas, and countless others continued to be whispered by grandparents to their grandchildren, becoming part of cultural identities and regional folklore. In many places, these ancient beings remain more beloved, more haunting, and more human than the refined vampire of Victorian fiction. What makes these early vampires so compelling is not simply the horror they inspired, but what they reveal about the people who believed in them. They expose a time when death was a constant presence, when science was still learning to explain the world, and when communities relied on shared myths to make sense of tragedy. A corpse that failed to decay might terrify us today for different reasons, but for our ancestors, it was proof that the lines between worlds were thin. The vampire, in its earliest form, was not a creature of fantasy but a symbol of everything that frightened humanity: illness, evil, the failure of nature to behave as expected, and the terrifying possibility that the dead were not as silent as they seemed. These legends remind us that the fear of the unknown is timeless. Long before Dracula cast his shadow across literature, humanity had already filled its nights with whispered stories of beings that walked after death. Each culture shaped its own version, but the heart of the myth remained the same: the sense that something ancient, hungry, and powerful lingered in the darkness just beyond the reach of firelight. And now, as modern storytellers rediscover these traditions, the old vampires rise again, not from graveyards but from the pages of history itself. They return not as monsters of superstition, but as echoes of human fear, resilience, and imagination. When we look back at these early accounts, we are not just studying folklore, we are witnessing the birth of one of humanity's most enduring legends. Their stories remind us that before literature refined the vampire into a charming aristocrat, the creature was something far more primal. It was the embodiment of the dread that haunts every civilization, that death may not be the end, that the night may hold secrets we cannot explain, and that the past may still breathe in the shadows around us. These ancient beings, rooted in real fears and real places, continue to shape our understanding of the supernatural even today. They belong not to the realm of fiction, but to the raw imagination of humanity, an imagination that never stops searching for meaning in the darkness. And so, as we close the chapter on these historical vampires, we realize that the myth has never truly been about monsters. It has always been about us, our fears, our mysteries, our need to explain what we cannot see, and our desire to believe that there is more to this world than meets the eye. The creatures that once terrified entire villages now fascinate modern audiences, but their essence remains unchanged. They are the shadows that follow us through history, reflections of the eternal human struggle to understand life, death, and the thin veil that separates them. This is the legacy of the vampire before Dracula, a creature shaped by centuries of belief, fear, and storytelling, long before literature crowned it king of the night. And now, as always, we let the darkness close gently around the tale. This is Ancienta, where forgotten worlds breathe again. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the oldest shadows of vampiric lore. If you wish to explore more mysteries, myths, and hidden histories from humanity's past, stay close. There are countless stories waiting beneath the dust of time. Until we meet again, keep your candles lit, your doors closed at dusk, and never ignore the whispers that rise in the night. For the oldest legends are never truly silent.